Okay, so at this time, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Katie Drudger.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay, great. We are so excited to welcome Lorena Germán as our keynote speaker today. I first got to know her through one of my favorite professional development tools, Twitter. After she was recognized by NCTE with the Early Career Educator of Color Award, she started to tweet great information, and she used the hashtag NCTE. She had thoughtful posts, and I started to just learn and read, lurked a little bit on her feed. Then I started to follow her. And then I actually kind of direct messaged her, cold called her and said, hey, can we be, Twitter friends? Now she is NCTE's Committee Against Racism and Bias in the Teaching of English's chair. And so she's doing incredible work under the hashtag CARBTE for Committee Against Racism and Bias in the Teaching of English. So check it out. She has done so much for NCTE, and we can tell you that she is motivating and passionate. We're so excited for you to hear her words today. Lorena is an immigrant from Dominican Republic and attended public schools in the United States from first through high school. She has a Bachelor of Arts in English Communication from Emmanuel College and a Master's of Arts in English from Middlebury's Breadloaf School. She advocates for culturally sustaining pedagogy so that students can lead us toward positive social transformation. She has extensive experience in extracurricular youth spaces and also in the traditional classroom. In addition to her work as chair of the Committee Against Racism and Bias in the Teaching of English for NCTE, she co-founded Disrupt Text, hashtag Disrupt Text. Her book, The Anti-Racist Teacher, Reading Instruction Handbook, is accessible and practical. And is available on her website, Multicultural Classroom. She lives with her beautiful family in Austin, Texas, where she supports teachers, schools, and organizations to practice anti-bias and anti-racism education at Headwaters School. So I'm going to pass it over to Lorena Germán, and I want to thank her again for joining us today.
Katie, thank you. I was just messing with you saying nice shirt. I'm really excited to be here with all of you. I know some folks who are here, so that's awesome. That's always good to see some familiar faces in the audience, if you will. And I'm just really grateful that Heidi reached out and invited me to come and share with all of you. I think that, when she messaged me, this stuff mattered. And I feel like right now, it matters even more, right? So like the need for all of this just continues, particularly for this subject, which is building an anti-bias and anti-racist ELA curriculum. There's work for all of us to do at every grade level and every content area. And I love talking to English teachers as an English teacher about what we can do specifically. So definitely, happy and excited to be here with all of you and hoping that this will be, I'm going to try my best to make this as interactive as it can be, just because, it's Saturday and we're in front of a computer and, we're taking time out of our day to engage in this work. So I know I'm already among folks who are, interested. It would be great for us to use the chat for thoughts and reflections as we're going along. So feel free to use it for that. I will make space for questions. I only say that because sometimes folks ask questions in the chat and then, it's like lost in cyberspace because I'm not going to be able to go back and find that. So I will make space for time for y'all to bombard me with questions so that I can make sure to get to as many as possible. There will be moments where we actually engage in a little bit of conversation. And so my hope and advice is that we'll be open, that we'll be honest, and that we will be present as much as possible. There is a little person knocking on my door.
Mom, it's Dad's computer.
Okay, hold on. All right, so let me just keep going. Annalise, we'll talk about this in a minute. So really quickly, I am gonna ask for this limitation, which is Please don't take screenshots and disseminate all of this information widely, just because this is my intellectual property that I am sharing with you. There are moments where I know you're going to want a screenshot for your own purposes and to keep, and there will be time I'll let you know, like, I know this is the thing you want to take a picture of, go for it. But I do ask that you just work with me on that. And, you know, if you do leave here and you're like, oh yeah, I want to share some of these ideas, just make sure that you cite me. That's all really, really important. So thank you ahead of time for supporting me in that. And I hope that it is useful and that you do want to cite and you want to take stuff and, you know, that we can make it work. So I think first, before we get into like strategies and the real, you know, hands-on part of doing this stuff, we need to have a little context. I'm going to assume a couple of things, that everybody here is already interested in doing this work, and that you see a need for doing this work. However, you might not have colleagues that agree with you. You might not have a department chair that agrees with you, or an administrator that agrees with you, or even a community, right? Like parents might not agree with you. And so what I hope to do for the first part of our time together is to set a little context and answer the question, why do we need to consider an ABAR, which is anti-bias, anti-racist teaching approach? Why do we need to do this for this time? And I know that for a number of us, I mean, for me, it's like obvious, like, why do we even have to break that down? But you know, that's the reality, right? Not everyone understands the way that life is right now for so many people in this country and around the world. And so I think that one of the things that I would have appreciated when I started to do all of this work myself was to have a really solid foundational understanding as to the why. Why am I doing this? Why does this matter? Why do I have to do this? Why should we all be doing this? So my hope is to equip us to be able to kind of have those conversations. And I want to start with this graphic, which actually speaks to young students. So we're going to start all the way from like pre-K and babies. And this graphic you can find online for free. And you can type in literally, they're not too young to talk about race, probably like PDF or something. And this populates. So this is not a secret, you know, research tool that I have. You're more than welcome to go out and use it and find it yourself. And what I find useful about it is that it walks us through, you know, it walks us through all of these stages of early development for children, and specifically in terms of race and bias and having these conversations. And I want to bring your eyes to a couple of things. I want to bring your eyes to the very first box. So when babies are born, okay, they look equally at all faces, right? Like they don't really have any bias, which is really important for us to understand that this is not a thing we're born with. This is very much a part of our socialization. This is very much a part of living in the United States, and whatever country you're in, actually, because we all have bias. And so this is a thing, bias, that we develop slowly but surely. And so they're going to look at everybody's face when they're born, you know, and they can define faces and stuff. And they don't really have any concept of hierarchy or meaning based on the color of anybody's skin or anyone's appearance just yet. But then we get to that third box, which says number 2. By 30 months, this is now about yeah, we're in the second year of life, right? Most children use race to choose their playmates. Like, whoa, we went from, I don't know, nothing to you look like me. I want to play with you. Let's be friends. Which I think a lot of us might be like, yeah, I mean, that makes sense. However, this is where the foundation for bias is established, right? That we can be friends with people who look like us, that's where we're going to be comfortable. And they're also seeing that modeled by the adults in their lives. So already pre-K teachers, we've got work to do. Then we move over 2 boxes to the one that says number 4. By 5, Black and Latinx children in research settings show no preference toward their own groups necessarily, right? And I think that that's mainly because we in this nation are already exposed to difference, right? We know that at home, our family might look a certain way, but at school, we know that people look differently. We know that at the supermarket, they look differently. On the news and in movies and in cartoons, you know, there's this difference that's already normalized. However, white children at this age remain strongly biased in favor of whiteness. And, you know, I think that one of the reasons why that happens is because they are not necessarily exposed to the same amount of difference. If at home your family looks one way, and at school folks look one way, and at the doctor's office they look one way, and in the cartoons that you watch they look one way, and in those books that you have in your home library and in your classroom they look one way, I can understand why you would be biased toward that one look, that one form of appearance. So kindergarten teachers, we have work to do. I hope, you know, that this is creating a sense of awareness. And again, I'm sharing this so that we can go back into our workspaces and make some of these cases and arguments to create not necessarily a sense of urgency, because that doesn't always work, but a sense of alarm and a sense of need that this is important. And then if you look at that last box, right, now we're headed into first grade, second grade, explicit conversations with these kids about interracial friendships. So being really explicit about being friends with someone who does not look like you, who does not talk like you, who does not come from where you come from, can actually have really dramatic effects within a week. Within a week, it seems, based on this research, that these children were already engaging with young people their age of other ethnicities and you know, racial identifiers. Within a week, there was already some change. I mean, if that's not hope, I'm not sure what is, right? Like that kind of change doesn't even happen for adults. That kind of change doesn't even happen for, you know, older students. So there is so much work to be done just in this short amount of time in the lives of children. And when we think about like, wow, well, where are they getting all of this? It's because bias and racism exist in all of our institutions, in all parts of our society. And so it affects all of us. No one is, you know, absent from being impacted by these ideas and this socialization. It impacts the adults, the teens, and as we can see, all the way down to tiny little kids that we would want to believe are very innocent, right? And that concept of innocence, we really need to interrogate it. Not because I often hear the argument, oh, well, who gets to be innocent? And that's true, that's a valuable question. But it's less about that. I still think that a lot of these kids are innocent and they're not necessarily coming outside their house at 30 months saying, today I'm going to discriminate. So no, they are being innocent, but they are victims, if you will, of this society that we as adults have created and sustain and maintain. So it begs the question, what can we as adults change in order to support them as they continue to grow? And so that's kind of how we start to, you know, as educators think about, well, how are we implicated, right? Like, what are we gonna do? So let's see, when we get to elementary school, right? So I'm thinking here like 2nd through about 5th grade, which is not this chart, but when we get into that age range, we start to see, and for those of you that are elementary teachers, you know, right? You start to see much more explicit conversations that they're having, especially when you're not having them. This is where comments are made because they're listening to the things being said at home and sometimes on TV that they might not understand, but believe to be true, right? And so come into school or at least with their friends in social spaces and use them. And sometimes, you know, they're even weapons. And they are fully aware of difference. They're fully aware of even social stigma. Right, this is when they make fun of someone because they're different, because he doesn't have, you know, because of a physical maybe challenge or just like a different look. Difference here in elementary school is no longer seen as something that is okay, that is, you know, just part of life or something to be celebrated. And so then it becomes like, okay, well then what happens when they get to middle and high school? And for those of us that work in middle and high school, we know what it looks like, right? And so a couple of years ago, Teaching Tolerance did this Hate at School report, which apparently they're going to keep doing for a little while, which I think is going to be important and really informative for us. And there's so much in that report. You can access that for free also online. They will mail it to you or you can get it as a PDF. And, you know, for me, this little chart, this little one screenshot, I mean, there's so much, never mind. All of it is really good. But this little screenshot right here in particular has been so informative and actually even motivating, as horrible as it is, because it just reminds me, like, girl, do not sleep. We have work to do. And so this is about the hate at school, hate and bias reports from teachers and students that they did at schools all across the nation. Of course, they took an unprecedented rise in 2016, which I think we all know what was happening in society at that time, the rhetoric that was being spewed with confidence, you know, from podiums and throughout the news and given airtime so that it could live in our social air and consciousness, right? And so now we see how it is present in schools. So the first circle, that first column, talks about the locations. Where's this stuff happening in schools? I know when I started to see this report, I was like, where? I don't know that I hear this. Like, where is this? Well, they were able to tell us that 37% of the spaces where hate and bias is happening is in the hallway, in the bathroom, elsewhere, cafeteria, if there's a, you know, before school, after school, those like lesser supervised spaces, okay, where young people are interacting with each other during school hours is where hate and bias is happening. It's the same places, y'all, where bullying happens, right? So that there's a direct connection between bullying and these hate and bias situations. Inside a classroom is the next place where this is happening. So inside a classroom means that they are having these conversations, making these statements, doing these things right underneath our noses in a sense, and sometimes right in front of us. They might think that we support it. They might not know where we stand and that this space, right, like this classroom of mine, there's no tolerance of that. It is not welcome. This thinking and this way is not welcome. So that's going to be really important for us as English teachers to consider when building this curriculum. And we'll come back to these ideas in a little while. And then who's doing this? Middle, high school, elementary? And look at those numbers. They are not pretty. It's not low. High school is the top place, but middle school is right there, right after. And there's less of a gap between middle and elementary school. So that kids between, you know, 2nd and 3rd and 8th grade are all engaged in this. They are all engaged in this type of hate and bias. And we know, we've seen it in high schools, right? In terms of all over social media and in the news, young people dressed in blackface or these racial slurs that are being used or the graffiti. These are things that aren't necessarily new. It's simply that they took an unprecedented rise in 2016. So our schools are seeing this element of society, which means that our schools have a role to play. We see it in all elements of society, but we're educators. So I'm not here to talk to you about what's happening at the doctor's office. I don't want to talk to you about what's happening at Planet Fitness and the gym. We're educators. So we're here to talk about what does this look like in schools. It's a lot. And so we go back to the point that education is implicated. And it's implicated in all of the subject areas: science, math, arts, social studies and history, gym class, the way that we structure our success and rewards, and values and culture. I'm going to pause here for a second. I'm actually going to mute myself just for a second. And what I want to do is offer you a personal moment, not in the chat just yet, although you might all be in that chat. I don't know. I can't see yet. But I'm going to give you a moment to think about how is it implicated in those subjects. And I'm going to challenge you to think about it, because I think a lot of educators in those other subjects, right, gym, science, math in particular, think that this is just work for us to do in English. That's a humanities topic. That's a humanities issue. So I'm actually going to stop for 1 minute, maybe 2, and give you a moment to just think. Maybe you're jotting it down. That's cool. Think, because I'm actually going to break it down. All right, let me give you that moment. Okay. And also now I'm mad because I'm realizing that I have a typo. Make pretend that says education and not education. Okay. All right. So how are these other subject areas implicated? First of all, the absence of the conversation of race and any kind of bias is the first implication. So if you are a math teacher and you believe that your subject is not related in any kind of way to any sort of bias, that's the first problem. So the absence, the silence speaks louder than anything else. And then we have to think about the way that bias, and I'm going to start using bias right now just for this conversation because it encompasses all types of bias. And this is not just about race in this moment. And so when you think about bias in general, in order for policies to be designed, in order for laws to exist that actually perpetrate bias, you need research and you need statistics. Where does that fall? Math. I'm thinking about, for example, the belief of, 3/5 of a person a long time ago here in this nation that actually formed a political foundation against African Americans. Well, that required mathematical concepts. That's a fraction. I'm thinking about the arguments right now existing against the LGBTQ community about their biological problems and how this is, essentially it's all scientific arguments, right? Attempts at scientific arguments to use to perpetrate bias. That's science. Jim, when we think about issues, again, facing particularly our transgendered students and friends, well, that can sometimes be a real serious hotbed of where bias is perpetrated. When we think about arts and whose art is valued, whose art is considered a culturally wealthy and worthy of study and using as a model, we start to see where there is bias. We already know it's so obvious in social studies and history, right? What is left out of the milestones of history courses of curricula, how things are told. And then when we look at success and rewards, values and culture, which go together, we start to see whose, not methods, but whose ideas of success matter. What rewards we're supposed to value. What values and which cultures are celebrated over others. All of that is biased. I hope that that's clear. And then I said all aspects in case I forgot something, because I'm sure I did. But, in general, we have to start thinking about what is the culture at this school and how might that be a reflection of a larger general social bias that we have in the United States? And because we are the best, hello, English teachers, we need to think about our role and our fields, okay? So what role does literature specifically play in all of this? How are we ELA teachers implicated? What role has our subject area played in the building and developing of racism and bias in the United States? That is a PhD question if I ever heard of one. So there you go. Any of you considering it, feel free to take that. So what role? And I think that it's a big question, it's a big concept, it's a big problem, but it is possible to actually begin to address that ourselves in our classrooms, with our departments, with our colleagues who are outside of our buildings, and as a field. And there's already so many people that have been doing this work with and for us. So many ways, right? Because there's a bias-based and white-centered curricula. We're gonna have to break that down. And I don't want any of my, white colleagues here in this Zoom to immediately feel like, oh my gosh, I'm doing something wrong. Not necessarily, in the sense that, yeah, you're right, you did not build this, but together we are sustaining it by not interrogating it. So this is not about necessarily attacking one particular group. It's simply pointing out, right? In this country, who happens to be the group that's mainly in power, politically speaking, financially, so economically, it's going to be white folks. And so we've got to look to you. If we were in Dominican Republic, which is where I'm from, then we would be looking at Dominicans there, but particularly men, light-skinned men. That's the dynamic there. Similar dynamic here in terms of gender, but we definitely see the way that it really is more about white people in general than it is about one gender over the other, right? But there is a gender issue. I don't want to minimize that, obviously. So many ways that we see this present, right? A bias-based and white-centered curriculum, exclusive approaches to teaching and learning and success. By exclusivity, I mean that it leaves people out. I'm thinking, for example, when education kind of started to formalize in this nation forever ago, I'm thinking about assimilation schools. It was about, leave this part of yourself in order to come here and participate in the learning and to succeed. It was about, boys will study this and girls will study that. It was about, you're going to learn this, biblical concept instead of simply thinking about actually just reading and writing and literacy. And then we get to long-held beliefs and unwavering commitments that are harmful, right? So some of those include, for us as English teachers, I'm thinking about the 5-paragraph essay. I'm coming for it, I'm sorry. And it's not that the 5-paragraph essay is a bad thing at all necessarily. I think the way we have used it has been somewhat harmful. Because for communities, for example, I'm thinking of, let's say, the Cochiti in New Mexico, they're, as a indigenous nation, their main form of literacy is spoken. So what happens when their stories were not communicated via writing? And most certainly their intellect among them is not based on how well they can master a 5-paragraph essay. We are leaving them out due to, right, so it's exclusive, due to long-held beliefs and unwavering commitments, which, by the way, are just in the United States. If you go study in Germany, they're not asking you for a 5-paragraph essay. If you go to Zimbabwe, they are not asking you for a 5-paragraph essay. So this is very much an American thing. It is not a universal thing, and it's a long-held belief at this point, and it is harmful when we place it above all other forms of assessment and writing, because we are excluding people based on our teaching, learning, and success, because it's this white-centered and bias-based curriculum. So that's in general in our field, but we are most certainly going to have to talk about text selection and the canon. And we're going to spend a little bit of time here right now. By nature, canons are exclusive. That's the whole point of a canon, is to let's pick this set so that we can stick to it. That immediately means you're leaving other things out. So they are exclusive in their design, and they are socially constructed. A group of people at one point in our history decided on these books. This was not something that came down from heaven like manna. I don't even know how to say that in English. Manna is in Spanish. Maybe it's manna. It did not descend upon us from the heavens, so that we could, and it's just this ubiquitous, like, oh, we will all just study these books because they're great. No, there was a group of people, men, who decided that. And so it is socially constructed. What's the problem then? Well, look at that second point. They reflect cultural values, right? And when that society is racist, it reflects one culture's values over others and celebrates those cultures over others and prioritizes them and demands them over others. And so then what happens? Well, this canon is supposedly preparing our young people to go to college by being well-read, because they know all that they have to know. And now you are ready to engage in rigorous conversation and intellectual, discussions with other people your age. And I say supposedly, I'm not being sarcastic, that, that is one of the things that we discuss, right, as English teachers, is that it's, this canon that we've used in high school and middle school is equipping our young people, helping them to be well-read in order to go and engage and do well in college, right? College preparation, that's essentially, or supposedly, what we're doing. But there's a problem. Because when we think about the canon, which we're about to get into in a moment, what messages And what message, although it's many, are these texts sending that we have selected? And the canon that we continue to teach. What message is that sending to students? I'm going to welcome you to, in the chat, share what you think some of those are. I'll try to read a little bit. What are some of those messages? Yeah, that's definitely one. Corey, I think I'm saying that right. That definitely is a message. Paige, yes, definitely. Kimmy, that is a result, right? That's not even the message. That's just what happens, right? Rocio, yes, I see that. Oh, Chris, yes, yes. Yeah, Laura, that definitely is a thing, right? That monolith. Yes, Josh. Yep. Okay. Well, let's explore. Let's figure it out. What is the problem with this canon? What you see here on the screen is research. I do not invite you to do it. You can if you like to, but it was rough times. This is a list of 20 of the most popular and most repetitive books throughout high schools in the United States. I went all over, you know, all the different book lists, as well as visiting actual schools that posted curriculum that showed what the books were that they were teaching for their English classes. We all have heard of these books as English teachers. Many of us have taught it. Many of us studied it in our own schools. So The Outsiders, To Kill a Mockingbird, and this is not in any order. This is just 20. The Great Gatsby, Fahrenheit 451, Brave New World, Lord of the Flies, Romeo and Juliet. You know these. Catcher in the Rye, 1984, Frankenstein, Hamlet, Animal Farm, The Crucible, The Scarlet Letter, Of Mice and Men, A Tale of Two Cities, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, Lord, Macbeth, The Odyssey, and The Grapes of Wrath. I know that I've taught many of these, required and not required, because we teach what we know, right? We teach what we have learned. So what's the problem? What I've done here on this slide, this is the same list, but I actually kind of did an audit. What year were they published? That's the first number you're gonna see here. So the first one, if we go back, was The Outsiders, right? Or the second one is To Kill a Mockingbird. Great. So 1967 is when The Outsiders was published. 1960 is when Mockingbird was published. Both of them are set in the United States. And so you'll see that Mockingbird, it says Southern US. And then what I did was, well, who are the main characters? Like, who's the story focused on? The first one is white boys, and the second one is white family. And so you'll see that the audit continues, right? For all of those 20 books. Number 4 is Fahrenheit 451. Or no, maybe it's number 5. Number 6 is Lord of the Flies. Number 13 is The Crucible. You'll see that there's a little asterisk next to some of them, because in those books you have a somewhat main character, or at least an important character, who is a character of color. So in 13, that's Tallulah. In 17, which is Huck Finn, we have Jim. And then when you look at number 10 is Frankenstein, white family, and monster. I included the monster because he's important. And he's not human though, so I included him there. But I think, you know, when we think about his culture, if you will, We would probably say white. I'm not even sure why. I think that's just a given, right? Like it's a white setting, it's a white family. We're in the UK and Britain. So, you know, we would assume that the body parts he's made of are from white folks. So there's this general, I think, understanding that he was white, although I'm not going to treat him that way in this itemization. So what happens? Then I color coded my research. Everything in yellow was published before 1950. So 1950 and earlier. Everything in in blue, everything with a blue highlight is to show you that it's a white-centered story. White characters, white families, etc. And the pink is when it features a character of color. So in number 2, that's Tom with To Kill a Mockingbird. In 10, we're gonna call the monster not a white person. In 13 is in The Crucible, and in 17 is Huck Finn. Okay, well, not Huck Finn, but Jim. So look at that. And what's up with focusing on 1950 and under? This might be a picture you want to take. Fine, you can screenshot if you'd like. You can screenshot this one. So I focused on the date of 1950 and below for a number of reasons. First of all, we're in 2020, y'all. And we're still reading books from 1859, from 1597, from 1925. And it's not that reading an old book is a bad thing, but look at the overwhelming number of these 20. So there's a pattern here. And what's wrong? The 50s were a great time in our country. Isn't that the Make America Great Again? Isn't that the era we're trying to get to? Well, let's understand the historical context. Up until the 50s in the United States, number one, women did not have the same rights as men financially, socially, professionally, or in everyday life. The movement for LGBTQ rights hadn't even started really like that in main society like we see it today, where these are conversations, where there's general openness and willingness to engage. Number 3, racial segregation was still a thing. Number 4, voting rights for the rest of us didn't exist yet. Number 5, Latinos and other immigrant groups, Chinese in particular, had minimal immigration rights. They were banned for a period of time in there. Number 6, movements for environmental changes and transformation had barely begun. Number 7, since the 30s, the Harlem Renaissance, we had not heard really about Black excellence at a national level, okay, as a nation. And number 8, Christianity was still the main form of religion and a spirituality accepted or deemed normal. So if these are the cultural values, we would be willfully ignorant to think that it is not present in our literature. So these are the values we are still teaching when we are choosing to overwhelmingly select these books in the top 20 that we're reading in our education right now with our middle and high school students. And I keep saying middle because, if we go back to the actual titles, Outsiders is often a middle school text. Mockingbird is often a middle school text. Fahrenheit is often in the middle school. Lord of the Flies, Frankenstein, Animal Farm, sometimes Of Mice and Men. Even Huck Finn and his friend, Tom Sawyer. I can't even with Tom. Okay, so The Adventures of Huck Finn, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, some of those are even in elementary. So we're really bringing this in early. We are implicated, folks. We are implicated. And so here's a visual representation of that same list. These are pictures of authors, and those are the books, all featured in that list of 20. It's not all of the 20, but it's a number of them. And so our literary canon is defined by this white gaze. And to better understand the concept of a white gaze, please look up Toni Morrison white gaze video, those 5 words. And you will see her in an interview talking about it and explaining it. Our literary canon is defined by this white gaze. And so we come back to this question. What message are these texts that we've selected and the canon we continue to teach sending our students. I'm going to pause here for a moment because Heidi, I believe we're taking a quick break. It's going to be something like a 5-minute break, because then we're jumping into breakout rooms or breakout groups, whatever that's called. And I'll post those questions for you to process together in your groups before we come back. And then I'm going to try to answer that question too. And that's when we're going to get into what the heck are we going to do about this then? What do we do?
So during this break, you have the opportunity to ask any questions of our Great Minds representative, Ken Wilmer. He is here with us. So I'm hoping he is here now. He was planning on coming at noon, so we're just a little bit ahead of schedule, but there he is. He's here. Awesome. So any questions that you have, you can go ahead and unmute. You could put them in the chat. Ken, feel free to tell us anything more that you'd like to share as well.
Okay, I appreciate the opportunity to come and speak to you guys for a few minutes. This has been a very informative presentation, I'll tell you that much. So it's great to hear, great to see. So for those of you who don't know about Great Minds, just a couple quick thoughts on it. Great Minds is the creator of a curriculum called Eureka Math, which is the most widely used math curriculum. And about 5 years ago, we came out with Wit and Wisdom. And what makes Wit and Wisdom unique is that it's really based on core text. It's not a basal type of curriculum. And it's a good thing that, you know, to add on to the presentation we just saw, one of the things that we're very proud of is the diversity and the diversification of the resources that we're using in our curriculum. So we believe in mirrors and windows. So when kids are looking at the books, they're going to see themselves and they're going to see other cultures and other experiences. But the key to Wit and Wisdom is that we're using these texts to really teach ELA skills. And what's unique about Wit and Wisdom is that we're teaching reading, writing, speaking, and listening all together, okay? We're big fans of, like, you know what? If you read about something, and write about something, the academics and the knowledge building will continue. So that's really kind of what, you know, Wit and Wisdom is about. It's really a knowledge building curriculum. That is, and we're just starting to bring it to Virginia, actually. I'm the Virginia rep, and I've only been, well, prior to COVID, we just started working in Virginia back in the fall. So we're making some inroads, but I'd be happy to answer any questions about Wit and Wisdom, about the curriculum. If anybody has any particular questions.
So Ken, I'm curious, what are the grade levels?
Wit and Wisdom is for K to 8. Okay, and there are teachers editions and student editions, and Wit and Wisdom in Sync is our new virtual curriculum. So that's kind of the world we're living in. We're kind of fortunate enough that Great Minds has curriculum developers right on staff. So when COVID hit, we came out with Knowledge on the Go, which was actual video lessons. And we've kind of transported that into Wit and Wisdom in Sync, which is a virtual version of Wit and Wisdom, which allows teachers to teach it using Zoom. There's digital PDFs that they can fill in, fillable PDFs throughout the curriculum, but it allows a virtual implementation of this ELA curriculum. So we'll see where that, where that is in 6 months from now. But right now, it's been a very popular option as far as just being able to teach Wit and Wisdom and ELA skills wherever students are. So, any other questions?
You said that Wit and Wisdom only goes through 8th grade. Do you have any suggestions for resources for high school teachers that are like Wit and Wisdom?
Actually, we are working on a high school version of Wit and Wisdom. Okay, it's funny because one of the things that we're finding as middle schools use Wit and Wisdom, and then they're transitioning to, so Wit and Wisdom is a knowledge building curriculum, right? So now we're transitioning into high school, and we're finding that when the kids get to high school, they're really very well prepared for how to analyze high school text. And that's one of the keys about Wit and Wisdom, is that we've got these routines that we're teaching students on how to analyze text and how to do effective writing. And they're working on those skills, and they're going to bring those skills to high school. And we're actually hearing from high school teachers that students are coming in with a better understanding of how to break down complex text and build knowledge from it. So, good question.
Oh, thank you.
Another question here, different entry points. One of the great things about Wit and Wisdom, so you talk about scaffolding and you talk about different entry points. Wit and Wisdom not only uses core text, but we also have poems, and we also are using art in our curriculum. Well, what does art have to do with ELA? The goal here is to get students to understand how to analyze and how to review content. So when you put up a picture, all right, and we ask students, what do you notice and what do you wonder about this picture? Pretty much any student will have a response, whether in English language learners or they're above or below grade level. They'll be able to interject and work within the curriculum. That same approach, what do you notice, what do you wonder, will now then be applied to whatever core text that we're working on or whatever poem we're working on. So using artwork, using different entry points within the curriculum by using different types of media is how we're dealing with specific students and their academic levels. And yes, it does, and Wit and Wisdom does match with your SOLs, which is always a good thing to have. So in fact, we just wrote a brand new math curriculum. I know you guys don't care about math, but Eureka Math was just rewritten completely for a Virginia edition. So it specifically aligns to the math version now has an SOL aligned curriculum as well. So any other questions? Do you have the ability to use it without a school license? Not really. I mean, we have interesting theory because our math curriculum actually is an OER. So you can actually go on the website and download the math curriculum and go. Wit and Wisdom is not an OER, unfortunately, but it is available. The in-sync version, Wit and Wisdom in-sync, the digital version, is pretty much a low-cost curriculum at this stage of the game. I mean, it's based on the number of students. The big expense with Wit and Wisdom is the core text, right? Because everyone needs the books. That's really the big expense with Wit and Wisdom. And again, that's only year one because you have to give everyone the books the first year. So there's a digital version. There is a digital teachers edition, which gives teachers links to all the various content that's necessary to teach the curriculum. And then each student gets a student edition, which has all the resources they would need. We also have a supplement called Affirm, which is our digital assessment tool. So all the assessments can be done online as well. Any other questions? All right, well, listen, I appreciate the opportunity to come and check with you guys. If anyone has any questions or wants additional information, I don't know how that works, but I'm gonna put my email address in the chat and you can reach out to me or you can click on the list there and I'll on the link there and they will get it to me. And I'd be more than happy to show you Wit and Wisdom in sync in depth someday. So thank you very much for your time.
Ken, thank you so much for being with us. Also in the email that I sent to all attendees, there's a link to his virtual exhibit as well. So you can also go through that portal as well. Okay, thank you so much for being with us, Ken.
Thanks, guys. I'm still going to listen in though, because I'm enjoying the presentation.
All right, Heidi, is it possible to do the breakout groups magic now and just send everybody into some groups?
Yes.
Okay.
How many rooms? We have 35 participants. How many rooms do you want?
Whatever's easiest. I mean,
You want groups of 4? I could do 9, or groups of 5. I could do 7.
yeah, anything between 5 and 9 is good, I think. Yeah, so that there's enough time. And I'll just walk through these. So some guided questions for these discussions. 1, how might this gap in our national literature impact social emotional learning? If you want to write these down and take a quick picture, that could work. I think I'll be able to also send it into the group magical internet window that pops in for you. 2, what questions or thoughts come up about the information from the Hate at School report? I know when I first saw it, I was like, what about this? What about that? And then number 3, what feelings come up for you when looking at the details about the canon? What feelings come up for you as an individual, maybe as like a former student, maybe as a current teacher? maybe, you know, your whatever your identity is, like maybe that is kind of getting stirred up a little bit. I think you're on mute, so just you nod yes. Yes, okay. So let's continue, and then I look forward to hearing from all of you. We'll have some time to do a whole group conversation too, especially since we're not huge and, you know, in the hundreds or something. But here are some of my answers to that question in terms of what is the message? What is the message that this text selection and canon is sending? First, that Black and Indigenous people of color's voices are not worthy to be studied, right? Because if I don't select any of those books, then I, as an English teacher, am saying that the content in those books is not valuable for me in terms of what I want my students to learn. And that's a very harsh message received, even if that's not what we are intending to send, right? But that's, you know, one thing is your intention and the other is the impact. That's the message that is received. And then that they are not the ones, right? That these voices are not the ones we can use for rich discussion. Think about the great, you know, discussion questions and writing prompts and tasks and analytical, you know, rigorous projects that you do with these books. When you are not selecting these voices, you're saying that actually their books, like I can't really do that stuff with them. They're not, those voices are not rich for conversation. There's not much analysis that I can do. And when you are not selecting these voices, right, the message is that the exemplary writing that you want your students to model can only be found in these sets of books. They are the best writers. That collection is, you know, that collection, again, I'm just looking at those 20 books, okay? That collection is the one that has the most merit and the most, you know, information for you to pull from, the space where you can do the most rigorous thinking is going to be found or created by those books, by that selection, among other messages. But I think those three are really important because they start to shape and mold our perception of those people and those voices. And, you know, those perceptions then, right, create a bias. That bias eventually turns into a belief. And that belief turns into discrimination. It's the action. Because then my identity as a reader is defined by these books that I select. By the time I get sixth graders and I introduce them to different types of books, I was just talking to Heidi, for example, with my group of sixth graders, we read Jason Reynolds' Ghost. And when I gave them these books, at first they were very taken aback, like, this book? Look at how it's written and how short it is. And, you know, there was so much prejudice that they had because they thought that big words and long books written by white people, particularly from Britain, like that's where the rigor is at. That's where adventure is found. That's where meaning happens. And so when we were digging deep into Jason Reynolds' characterization of that character and thinking about the social issues that arise and the complexity of all of those characters and those situations, they were like, I would never have chosen this book, but this is now, you know, my top 3. And my goal was not necessarily to put it into their top 3. It was to expose them and to help them see that these are voices that are worthy to be studied, that they can be used for rich discussion, and that there is writing here that is exemplary for all of us to model. And so something else for us to consider, 3 things that I think are important for us to consider. Consider the impact that this issue of this narrow canon and this text selection, consider the impact that this issue has on the teacher-student relationship. Why should I, this immigrant, you know, I'm gonna go all the way back to high school now, 10th grade, this immigrant Latina in this town where most of my teachers are selecting these books, why should I trust this teacher? If she or he does not, at the time, let me see, 10th grade he, if he doesn't think that anything written by people, for example, from my country is worthy to be studied here, or anybody that looks like me in this country is worthy to be, like it's not even present in the curriculum at all. Why should I trust you? Why would I think that you think I'm smart? And so then we have to consider number 2, consider the impact this has on student engagement. Why should I engage? Why should I be excited to do this essay for you? Why should I be excited to come to class after these other classes, my exhausting day, to sit here and talk about this book, all of these books? And so, you know, Dr. David Kirkland, a mentor of mine, has talked to me before about that, the concept that that the student is not disengaged, but that the curriculum is disengaged. And that perspective, that shift, is actually, I think, empowering for us teachers. Because what that means is that actually I can do something about the disconnection and the disengagement in my classroom. It is much harder to try to inspire a kid than it is to say, oh, I can just handle this through my own curriculum and text selection. And then third, consider the way that this literary reality molds our students' imaginations. And that one, friends, I'm going to call you friends, that one is really important for us to consider. And I'm going to spend a quick moment, because actually I didn't plan on it, but now that we're here, you know, the students' imaginations, that is so critical. When we go all the way back, and I was going back to that, chart from the beginning of like kindergarten and pre-K, what happens when all of those books are either centering white, typically boys, but white boys and girls, or animals, puffy, cute, adorable puppies and bunnies or whatever, because that's really in publishing what's happening in pre-K. Those are the 2 groups that have the majority of publications. So what happens when that is who they're seeing, and that is who, is filling up their imagination with good stories and complexity of characters, and they're just not seeing the rest of us, literally the rest of the world, through these lenses. That's how we get to these perceptions later that become prejudice and bias. And that's how we get to people that become adults and see a particular individual and think danger. Or decide, I'm going to take my AR-15 and go to Kenosha, and if someone disagrees, they're not worthy, so I'm just going to shoot them. Or here I have a gun and I have the power to use it, and even though I am the one in power as a police officer, you are representing a danger to me. So this is how we are implicated as a profession, as English teachers, because of the way that we are molding these imaginations through silences and gaps. So what can we do? Okay, I'm going to transition us from all of that context building into like, what do we do? What are the resources? How can we take action? And that really, to be very, very honest, it would really be a second workshop. But I do want to spend some time here. So one source that I use and talk about a lot is this set of standards, social justice standards, published by Teaching Tolerance. Again, this is free for you and online. You can find a PDF, or you can get them to mail it to you, and you can annotate it, like I have, where I don't even know how many words are on each page anymore. And I'm going to explain why I think this is really useful, particularly for English teachers. It's useful for all teachers because it's actually across grade levels and subjects. It's an anti-bias framework. But I think that for English teachers, it presents us with a really helpful approach to designing lessons and units. So ABAR work in general has this frame, or this structure designed by Dr. Louise Berman Sparks, who worked primarily with elementary students. And she talked about these 4 domains. If you see those 4 words in the center of your screen: identity, diversity, justice, and action. And she talks about those 4 areas as being really critical to developing a sense of social justice, and also just a sense of self and civic engagement. So what Teaching Tolerance did was consider her work and turn it into really tangible and practical steps for us to use in the classroom. The identity domain focuses on self, helping young people to learn about who they are, to celebrate who they are, to be proud of who they are, to understand their identities, not at the expense of others. which is really important, right? I can say, for example, through identity, which is actually the very first standard, I know and like who I am, and there are others that are different than me, and that's fine. Because actually, you know, white supremacy or racism, you know, like in general, is completely about, I like who I am, supposedly, but I don't like who you are, and you're less than me. That's how that works. And so this first, you know, domain does a good job of helping us to help young people develop a sense of self-esteem and confidence in their identities, all of them, not at the expense of others. And then in diversity, that domain is all about others. How do I celebrate others? How do I recognize who's around me? How do I express curiosity respectfully for others? Instead of saying things like, ew, you know, like at the supermarket, ew, that person looks like color of poop, which is like the dreaded thing that we all don't ever want to experience. But it's a very natural thing, especially if nobody is talking to them about melanin. That's going to happen, y'all. So if we are able to have conversations where we celebrate and embrace diversity in our classrooms with our students, then we're going to, you know, essentially avoid some of that. Then we get to justice. Justice is the one that I think a lot of teachers struggle with, and they think they don't know how to do, and they think is nearly impossible, but it is not. And for us as English teachers, it's really easy, actually, because so many books are already talking about the isms. Justice, that domain, is all about the systems that exist in our country that impact us. So if you think about this in a linear way, like you start with yourself, then you think of others, and then it's like, okay, and where are we? That's the justice domain. Where are we? How does this place work? How do you exist in this place? How do I? And then how do we exist here together? And so when you take books that bring in new voices, which are not new, just new to you, maybe new to your curriculum, right? They're going to bring in issues and topics that you haven't explored before. And those isms will be present. And so you can have conversations about justice. And then we get to action, which is the one that everybody likes, because this is the cool project where they write a letter to the mayor and you love them and you post them and you hang them in the hallway, right? Or they create a drive, or they, you know, do a big mural. But you can't get to action, or at least you should not get to action, until your students have a sense of the ism. Otherwise, it's superficial and it's very performative. We wrote a letter to the mayor. Cool. Why? Well, because, you know, there's this problem, I think, and in the book, instead of understanding like, oh, well, actually, because there's issues of discrimination in our community, and there are people who are being harmed by that, and I want to do my part to help them. That's a much more thoughtful response, because there is a context now, because we talked about identity, because we talked about diversity, because we talked about justice, we can now take meaningful action. And so what does this mean for us in English? Well, these standards give us language, literal, actual, like use this phrasing to design writing prompts, to design reflection questions for discussions, to design tasks and project-based learning assessments. Go into those standards, particularly, so like the identity and diversity ones, I think are ideal for conversation, for the reflection questions and the writing prompts. And then I think the justice and the action ones are helpful to designing these projects and these assessments, and, you know, like what's going to be the big essay, or what's going to be the big task that we do at the end of this unit or midway through the study of this book. You have all this language here that we can use to design our lessons, and it's research-based, and it's across all grade levels. They start with kindergarten all the way through 12th grade. I'll pause there. And I am going to talk about my book, which Katie mentioned earlier, and I hesitated because, you know, for obvious reasons. But here's the thing. I don't know yet of another book that is doing what I've attempted to do here, which is why I wrote it, because I wish I had it. So, you know, listening to Toni Morrison, who says, write the book that you wish you could have read, I was like, okay, fine. So here we are. And so this workbook presents us with 4 strategies at the end. I've thought about like, okay, how, like, what's the how? How do we do this? And so 4 strategies for us as ELA teachers: pausing and discussing, building counter narratives, focusing on minor characters, and teaching socio-political context. Those are 4 strategies that we can use as we design lessons and are helping young people process books and work through units. And so, what are some of these strategies about? Well, pausing and discussing is about 2 things, those first 2 bullet points: fighting ourselves to rush through a curriculum or books because we got to get through it, because the next unit, because we have a test, because we have this or that. And so fighting that urge to rush through things and instead pausing, and then doing number 2, finding the moments that speak to bias and focusing and honing in and zooming in with our students. And it's not about you standing on a soapbox and saying, you see this huge problem? No, no, no. Think of it as, you, like the magic school bus. I've been home too long. Think of it as like you walking your students through the forest. They're going to see all kinds of things. The forest is the book, but you want to make sure that they notice these 4 things because that's part of your goal as you walk through the forest. And so they might notice the porcupine, and that wasn't your plan, but you can stop and y'all can look at the porcupine. But your goal is to show them the nests that are above in all the trees. You're still going to do that and say, hey, do y'all notice any of these nests? And you don't have to even say anything. They will, once they look, they will lead that discussion and conversation. And then the third point is ensuring that stereotypes are dismantled and truth is shared. That's what you do when you build and teach counter narratives. You are directly, explicitly going against social stereotypes that exist against these groups, and you are sharing truth. And then by focusing on minor characters who are way too often marginalized people, you're not ignoring side minor or secondary characters, and you're considering their role and impact on the plot. For example, how often do people, when they're teaching To Kill a Mockingbird, stop and pause and really give time to Calpurnia? If not for Calpurnia, this family literally would not have survived, because it doesn't seem like Atticus can do it by himself. So how much time do we give her? If not for Tom, there would not be a story. There wouldn't be a story. Because even Boo Radley wasn't enough to make the summer what it was. So are we stopping to give these characters space and time? And that way, showing our young people how to see these characters and how to ask those questions and notice like, you're right. Without this character, without Jim, Huck wouldn't, what is he gonna do? How's he gonna survive? And then that last one about teaching socio-political context, it's not about partisan politics, folks. This is not about standing there and again on your soapbox saying you got to vote this way or this is this party or that party. No, I am not interested in doing that in my English class necessarily, unless it's like explicitly in the book, which I can't think of a book that does that. This is about understanding your reader bias and your positionality. Questions such as, what does it mean to be reading To Kill a Mockingbird in the age of Black Lives Matter as a Latina in this classroom with a group of 15, ninth grade students, most of which are white students in Texas in 2020. That's what that means. What is my reader bias and what is my positionality as I'm coming into this text? That's socio-political context. Also, what was Harper Lee thinking when she was writing this? What was going on in her time period? What influenced her to do this and to write this and to put all these things into the story? That is what teaching socio-political context means. And so if we go back, don't mess with me now. Here, there. That's kind of the breakdown of those 4 strategies, okay? So you could easily blend the work of teaching tolerance and this workbook, or you could, not and just go with one or the other to help you in designing your lessons and the ways that you use the books that you have. And let me just clarify a couple of things. So, you know, there are, and I'm going to put my quick disrupt text hat on just for a second, because I'm fully aware that there are many of us in schools where we really don't have the autonomy to select and change and move books around. We've received what we have received. We have been told what to teach. And maybe you can only pick books from the book room and it's like whatever's there, right? So I'm fully aware that sometimes it's not going to be that you can actually remove a text. And so that's why it's important to think about, okay, how can I teach this text critically then? How can I supplement this text? Maybe it's about reading an excerpt of that book, an excerpt of another book, and that's how you get a whole work in. And for those of you who do have autonomy to design your curriculum, then we've got work to do. You got to get on it. Because you can actually make, the choices to diversify your collection and your text selection to present your young people with a much more holistic understanding of who people are in this society. And you can start in 1922 and end in 2020. Nothing stops you from doing that either, right? So again, this isn't necessarily about remove all those books from the canon from your curriculum. I mean, I did, and I'll tell you why. But that's not always necessarily called for, right? This is why sociopolitical context is important, not just for books, but for us to think about as teachers. And I'll leave you with this short anecdote before I move on. The school that I was just at for about 6 years, predominantly white school, private school here in Austin, Texas, but also a very liberal and progressive school where I ended up finding support and space to do a lot of this work. What I realized was that, after we did this whole curriculum audit for ourselves, we did it as a department, we realized that there were some really important gaps, particularly in 10th grade. And so I looked at 10th grade and I said, okay, so this is what you're going to teach and you don't want to change it. Got it. It's all old, white male. Yeah, it was all old white male American lit and some British lit. So, okay, I guess since you're not going to change that, I'm going to have to change mine, which for me was totally exciting. So guess what we did in 9th grade? It was all 100% people of color, authors, and people of color characters. Why? Because there was an imbalance. And therefore, I had to create another imbalance in order to have balance. This is the anti-racist discrimination that Dr. Kendi talks about in his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. I'm not necessarily endorsing the book. I'm just saying that concept I think is really helpful, right? Because if they're going to get all of that next year, I don't need to add to that. What I need to do is compensate. I have to overcompensate now for this gap that this person is creating for them, right? And so you have to think about who is in front of you, where are you, and what power and autonomy you have. All right, I'll stop there with that part. So our actions in, pedagogically speaking, they have to go beyond representation. I hope that you've noticed that in those two sources and those two, exploration of sets of strategies, I didn't say, make sure you have those voices present, because that's not enough. It is about meaningful conversation. It is about using those books to show exemplary writing, to do rigorous analytical work. It's about developing a critical lens, helping our young people, like Freire says, to read the word and the world. How does this book create a lens for me, or sharpen mine, or help me to understand and process what's happening in our society better? And it's about welcoming voices that have been historically excluded. Because what that means is that the issues that those voices are raising have also been excluded. And the point of view that they present has also been excluded. And it's about making space for what we value. We teach what we value. We teach what we know. We teach what we think matters. If we are not, whatever we're not teaching, we don't value, that's the message, right? And we don't think it matters. It's about a culturally sustaining pedagogy. To go back to some of the comments that I saw, particularly I saw Josh say, that when we select some of these books, particularly written by folks of color, And the ones that portray us through white eyes and white voices, you know, too often we pick the ones that are really sad, that are really painful. Why? Well, because we want to, you know, we might have a good intention and we want to stir empathy in our students and we want to move them into action. But if that's all you got in your curriculum, then what stops me as your student from believing that African Americans are simply wrapped up in pain? That Indigenous people are relegated to the past and defeated and conquered? That Latinos are just immigrants who hate their, well, not hate their countries, but like had to leave because of, you know, just lack thereof to come here to the, you know, flourishing United States. So we need to also think about, again, that first one, meaningful conversation, and go simply beyond representation into a pedagogy that helps you to sustain people's cultures and the complexity of that. And that's why I say positive social transformation, which comes from culturally sustaining pedagogy. That is their language, Dr. Paris and Dr. Aline. It is about positive social transformation. And I'll say this, the time we're in as a nation right now is quite literally chaotic. Both COVID and these elections and just everything going on, right? Remote teaching, just all the things. And I think that one thing we all have in common in this country, everybody, even those who are, you know, the left or Trump supporters, right? The thing that we all have in common is that we think society needs to change. Because implicated in Make America Great Again is that America is not great right now. So if we all think that society needs to change, then we clearly all believe that we need positive social transformation. The question is which type, and I'm hopeful that those of us, at least in this Zoom, are aiming towards the type of social transformation that presents all people as whole, that celebrates difference, and that is anti-racist and anti-bias, which is why we need to work toward that in our own curriculum. I'll stop here for real this time and welcome us into more of a conversation. I've got some questions here for all of you in the case that, you know, folks didn't have questions for me. But you know, I'm open to just talking and hearing from you. I'd love to hear also maybe something that came up in your breakout groups. And here's what I would love to know too. Is there a realization that you have had today? Is there a realization that you've had from this content? And hold on, because I think I lost it. I hope y'all can see it. Maybe not. Let's see. I think I'm not sharing my screen anymore, but I will in a moment. There you go. Okay, there you go. So is there a realization you've had that you had not considered before, right? Maybe something new came up today and you're like, man, I had never thought about that. What change, if any, feels impossible? Maybe you're sitting here like, sure, I believe all this, but I can't do this, you know, whatever, this thing. Maybe you're already like, oh my, I got to change this thing. What's an immediate change you want to consider or explore? And then maybe you have general Q&A. I'm wondering if we have any elementary teachers here or primary teachers who often want me to, you know, talk a little bit about what this looks like at their level, you know. But yeah, so I'm actually going to stop sharing so I can see all of you. And I'm going to do this little gallery view thing and hopefully, yes. So this is a moment to just talk and I'd love to hear from you. Maybe in the chat you could say me and then we'll call on you. I think that might be one of the simplest ways to do this together. Don't be scared, it's okay. I promise.
I was gonna say, now's a good time to turn on your cameras too, maybe for conversation. I know when I try to have conversations with my students and their cameras are all off, it's a little disheartening.
People are in circumstances, it's all good. Oh, Corey, yes.
Yeah, I really liked what you were having to say about teaching the social political context, not just about when the book was written, because a lot of people do that, but talking about what it means to read it right now, because I don't think people do that a lot. I feel like a lot of times in the English classroom, it's like you're in this bubble, you know, like the outside world doesn't exist. We're in the world of this book we're reading, and we're in the world of this time. And, you know, I do think that it's, you know, you can't remove the text from when it was written, you know, like I feel like the powers that be tried to do that, and it, you know, it doesn't work, you know, it doesn't work. And I think that there's a lot of power in doing that. Like, what does it mean to read this book now? Like, what does this book have to teach us about right now? Not just books from the canon, but, you know, especially books that are written by, you know, actually diverse authors. But doing that with books in the canon could be a good way to bring those themes in if you have to teach that kind of stuff.
Yes, Corey. Thank you for pointing that out, for sure. And when we do that, when we say, oh, you know, Harper Lee wrote this in 60, this is what was going on at the time, and we just explore it from that like literary perspective, that allows us to make the arguments that people make today, which is, but Harper Lee was a person of her time. We can't criticize her with the 2020 lens. Well, guess what? There were anti-racist activists then. And Harper Lee was not one, clearly. And she has critiqued herself. And I don't mean to just spend time on her. That's just the name that came to mind, right? Because we can do that with anyone. People say that about Shakespeare. People say that about all of these other authors, right? And so when we think like, oh, we're just going to strictly depoliticize, without saying that, right? We're going to strictly just understand what was happening at this time in this society, not her life, but like this book, understand setting. That's a very limited understanding of setting, right? Because the author is embedded in their writing. As much as we want to believe that authors are not, and that they're writing fiction, that they're making up a world, you know, that they're disconnected and there's nothing of themselves, that's not true. That's not true. You know, too often have characters added, you know, their mom in there, right? Or elements of their trauma in these characters, or the conflicts are a thing that they've dealt with and can relate to. So we are embedded in our writing completely. And so, yeah, that's why teaching sociopolitical context is helpful, because it helps young people to be able to air some stuff, right? Like, what does it mean that Mark Twain wrote about slavery and had a character in slavery 20-something years after slavery was over? Why? Not to necessarily present us with an enlightened view of that, you know, peculiar system, as Harriet Jacobs calls it, or the peculiar institution, right? It was like, no, we're just going to go back and we're going to stay there for a little bit. I'm going to use the N-word 18 times on page 94 for fun, right? So I think it's okay, and it's helpful, and it's educational to help our students interrogate that stuff, you know? Great point. I could talk about that forever. Anybody else? Donna, Miss Donna, yes. Oh, you're on mute. Of course. That's like the 2020.
Let me talk for 10 minutes and then unmute myself. So I'm working on a project with some other professors where we have analyzed children's picture books that are diverse. And we worked with some students, some elementary students on a project, and they didn't want to read. The goal was we were trying to give them books where they could see themselves. Well, they didn't want to read those books because the first books that we shared were Booker T. Washington and the slavery. Everything was very deep, dark content. But then when we started we found more texts that were more relevant, that were showing them in normal everyday life situations. Then they started to be able to see it as a mirror. And so, but they were so used to seeing these picture books that were, you know, animal characters or white people. And so they wanted what everyone else had, until we started sharing books that showed people of color, people, you know, of different races, of disabilities, with in normal everyday situations. So I think it's really hard, or it's really important to be able to introduce them to books like that before you start with some of the heavy topics, in order to get that conversation going.
Absolutely, Donna. That's a very important point. And that's why you've had this big shift in publishing, I would say in the last maybe like 3 years, where you have more and more authors of color writing about themselves or writing about us. And that's why that's so important, this whole own voices approach to writing, because, you know, we are not always necessarily going to write about history. We don't see ourselves in the past all the time, right? Like, we all know we have a past, we all have ancestors, but we're also alive and well today. We exist right here in the now. And so we need more books that show us in this way, like Jimmy just kicking a ball and going to soccer. Or, you know, I don't know, I've got some that are sitting right here next to me, but, you know, I'm thinking too about, like, one of my biggest faves right now is author Derek Barnes and his books, Crown, I Am Every Good Thing, and The King of Kindergarten. I just love what he is doing. He is so intentional. He is so strategic in these books that he is writing about creating an anti-racist counter narrative. That just comes to mind because I'm just like, I love it. But there are so many other books too that are presenting these characters, you know, as in their everyday life, as you're saying. And you're right, it can't be that we're always portrayed in these painful ways and in these, you know, presentations of defeat and being conquered. And I invite you to, not just you, but anyone here to read, I'll type it in the chat. It's a letter written by Dr. Eve Tuck. She's Indigenous, and it's called Suspending Damage. And pretend there's another quotation mark there. And what she does in that letter is she spends some time talking about the ways that when we select these books and when we're always presenting folks of color, she's talking there about Indigenous people, but when we do that and we present just them and their pain and suffering, that we're actually creating a damage-centered narrative, which is a really interesting and helpful concept so that we stay away from that, right? And she doesn't say, well, don't talk about our pain either. That just can't be it. That is not the totality of our experience. It is okay to talk about, you know, the reality and the truth and the effects of slavery in this country perpetrated against African Americans. But that's not it. They were also dancing at the time, right? Like they have their own entire culture and way of being, and they still resisted and survived and are with us today. And that's beautiful. And so how do we show that joy as resistance, but even just their resistance in general, right? So yeah, Donna, that was a good point. Josh, hey, you can say something.
Hey. So one of the things that I've noticed, I mean, this is like my personal experience with students, but I've heard it from other folks as well. Students and like families seem to be more like receptive to bringing in books that are, you know, anti-racist. I've been getting a lot of pushback when I introduce things by LGBTQ writers. I mean, that's sort of like, I'm not, you know, this is not the oppression Olympics here, but I'm just like, that's what I'm kind of getting now. And I've had students, because I am a gay man, they're like, oh, well, you're just pushing this agenda. I mean, that's, for me, is like the new hurdle to, like, you know, overcome.
Yeah, that's definitely a thing. And, you know, I wonder, so I'm keeping my eyes on that too, Josh, thanks for bringing it up, because I'm noticing more and more, a couple of things. One, too many of our books, well, there's more and more books now featuring LGBTQ characters as main characters, but for a little period of time there, they were the sidekick, right? Like the gay best friend and the, you know, whatever. They were these minor characters. And when they were these minor characters, I feel, I haven't done the research, this is just me in my, you know, just experience, there was a little less pushback. So, you know, I think that one of the messages that I'm receiving from that is, well, it's okay if they're on the side. We just, right, like we could just, they could be the elephant in the room, but we just can't talk about them. We can't really think about the depth and complexity and truth about their experience. So I think that that is horribly problematic and terrible. And I think that we fight against it in the same way that we have fought everything else. You keep teaching it and you keep selecting it and you have the conversations, and you just keep pushing. And they're going to be banned books, just like African American books were, just like Latino books were, just like bilingual books were, and bilingual education in general. We keep pushing. I don't know that there's anything new. I think it's simply just part of the whole diversifying our canon. You know, we press in. But I think that, you know, I have also found that the ones featuring these characters, just like the ones with, you know, ethnically diverse characters, are often a big hit with students. Because if we go back to the idea that these are voices and issues and topics that have been excluded, now they're in, and it's like, oh yeah, I want to learn about this. I want to hear about this, you know? I see a hand, yeah. Cheryl.
So I wanted to, and this is going to be kind of a political statement, so my apologies if people don't agree, but kind of to piggyback on what Josh said, and I'm going to open it to both the LGBTQ community and all that we're seeing with Black Lives Matters. Honestly, until heterosexual and white people are speaking up and talking about it, is it going to be normalized? And then really the gap is bridged. And so as a white privileged female teacher, I want to use my white privilege, not lean on it. And I want to talk about those things and make them normal and make them okay to talk about and okay to have conversations about. And so I guess that's kind of my encouragement. It's a lot harder for Josh to try and open that door and encourage people to read characters who are in the LGBT community, because he is. Now I'm in there because I'm an ally and my daughter is, but I'm not myself and I'm not Black. So I can talk about it. And then people are like, okay, a white person is saying that, a straight person is saying that, maybe it is okay. I'm making it okay. So can we, as teachers across the state and the country, be doing more of that? That's my
Cheryl, thank you for that point. Let me build on what you're saying on two things there. I think that so one thing is that we're not, and when I'm saying we right now, I'm thinking like as also a cisgender straight woman, I'm not making them or any of those folks with those identities normal. I'm simply welcoming their identity into my classroom, right? Yeah. Which I think is what you mean to say. But I think it's important for us to be really clear and targeted with our language, because I wouldn't want someone to feel like, oh, until Lorena said it, I wasn't normal. That's not, that's not it.
No, so, I get what you mean. Yeah.
And, oh, come on, pregnancy brain, don't kick in now. Well, I really wanted to make sure to say that. And I agree that we use our privileges in order to, make sense, to make space. And the other thing I was gonna say too, is that it's not so much that now all of us, so I guess my point, Cheryl, is you might face pushback too, right? Like people are gonna be like, there's that Cheryl on her soapbox, I don't wanna hear it. And then you might also get, pushed to the side and ignored. And I know that's happened for me, particularly at the school I was just at, whenever I kept saying like, hey, we do not have Indigenous voices in our curriculum across 7 years. And so I think it's important for us to know that we advocate and we make demands. And it's not that it's harder for Josh or harder for an Indigenous person. It's simply that they've been doing it long enough and the rest of us need to participate and partake, right? They should not have to carry that alone. I, as a Latina, should not have to carry this alone. There should be other people fighting alongside me, right? And using their space and knowing when I need to stop so that they can carry that for me, right? So those are just some thoughts, Cheryl. Those are good points. Thank you. I see another hand. Paige.
Yes. My experience that reiterates how important it is to have allies is that I'm a cis, white, queer woman in a marriage that looks heterosexual because I'm married to a straight white dude. So I don't get pushback sometimes on these texts until I tell my students I'm part of this community.
Mhm.
And then I get sometimes what Josh was saying he's heard, you know, well, you're only teaching this because you're trying to push some kind of a agenda. Like, am I? Or are we just talking about
Right.
stories from people who exist in the world?
Correct.
Right?
Mhm. Yeah. I mean,
Yes, allies, we need you.
that's the work. Correct. Correct. That's why, you know, and Heidi, we'll wrap up here because I think it's time and I want to respect folks' time. But that's why this is, you know, that's where the phrase collective liberation comes from, right? That it's not about, oh, guess what? Immigrants are now fine. We're out of cages and we get to be here. We all have documentation. Cool. The struggle is over. No, you know, maybe for your community, a part of that struggle is over, but until we're all free, we are not all free, right? Until the most marginalized of our groups is not free, we are not all free. And that goes all the way up to even white women, right? That freedom from the patriarchy is gonna bless the rest of us too. And our freedom is gonna bless y'all too. It's gonna trickle and it's going to be embedded in the freedom that we all, you know, need so desperately, because this is about life and death right now. So I will leave you on that note that this is about life and death.